With Valentine's Day right around the corner, love is in the air, which makes it a perfect time to talk about why you should not use metaphors like that in your writing. Love, unfortunately, is one of the most difficult subjects to write about without coming across as sappy or overly serious. So, let's use today to talk about all of the ways that you can avoid the cliches and lean into the things that will make your writing about love really sing. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. If you're working on a memoir, chances are there will be a moment in that book that you need to talk about love. That might be romantic love, might be familial love, it might be a really close friendship. At any rate, you're probably going to need to talk about that point when you knew you were in love, whatever that might have looked like for you. But this is such a trap because since love is such a universal feeling, oftentimes how you experience that love is kind of based on what you've read or watched in movies or TV shows, and that makes it so hard to avoid pulling in those same cliches that you probably used to make sense of what you were feeling. On the other hand, if we use this correctly, this can be one of the biggest benefits of writing love into your book. Just think, if we are writing about an emotion that most everyone has felt on some level or in some form or in some context, that is one of the strongest umbrellas of truth. Now, if you haven't caught my video on why truth is more important than facts in memoir, check that out. We've also got a blog post on pageandpodium.com that corresponds with that and all of our videos. But what I want to talk about with the umbrella of truth here is that anytime we are writing about something that is going to feel true for most people, we can really seize the opportunity to invite others to feel along with us. And as readers, isn't that what we want? Don't we want to feel that emotion right alongside the author? Love gives us such an opportunity to lean into that, but only if we do it well. Unfortunately, if we write love poorly, if we use cliches, if we don't complicate things enough, oftentimes the result will be basically stamping our book as an amateur effort. Oh, nobody wants it. It's the worst, right? So that's why today I want to first go through kind of a main way of thinking about love, thinking about how to write about love, that's going to give you just a sort of rule of thumb as you move through your book. And then I also want to give you some specific things to avoid, things that are going to stand out to readers, literary agents, publishing editors, as well as some of the things that you can really lean into, some of the ways that you can make that writing about love richer and more interesting and more inviting to your readers. Okay, so the first thing that I want to share is that whenever we're writing really anything, the biggest thing we want to keep in mind is that it is conflict that is going to drive forward your story. When we are reading a book, we need that tension that's arising from those moments of conflict because that's what keeps us interested. When there's a conflict on the page, we want to know how it's going to turn out, right? So pulling in those moments of conflict, that's what we really need. What makes that so difficult with love is that very often when we are writing about a memory of early love, we don't usually remember the conflicts, right? We will usually tend to remember the things that made us fall in love with that person. And that is true no matter what. That is true with romantic love. That is true with meeting our friends, our very close friends for the first time. It's true of love within our family. It's true of love with our children. That is true in all forms of love. Our brains just have this way of forgetting about all the hard stuff and really highlighting the really good stuff. So the main rule of thumb that I want you to keep in mind is that as you are writing these scenes about love, the most important thing you can do is keep conflict at the center. Now, quick primer if you don't remember your days of junior English going through what the types of conflicts are, I want to just really quickly cover those before we get into the specifics. So you'll remember that we've got three types of conflict in literature. Now, sometimes people will parse this out differently, but I think three is plenty here. So the first one is person versus self. With person versus self, that is an internal conflict that you are facing. This is very common in love, right? Oftentimes we're really conflicted about falling for someone, particularly a romantic partner, right? Oftentimes that can feel really, really scary. So person versus self is something we can lean on here. The second type of conflict is person versus person. This is arguably the most difficult to wrap your brain around when it comes to writing about love. But keep in mind, your person versus person, first of all, does often happen in loving relationships. But second of all, remember that your conflict, your person versus person conflict, does not need to exist within that two-person relationship. It's also totally normal for there to be an extra type of conflict that's happening outside of that relationship that you're writing about. That can make things so rich if you can bring that person versus person conflict onto the page. And then the third type of conflict is person versus nature. Now, this is parsed in all different kinds of ways. I'm putting it into one kind of umbrella category, but this can be where you are battling against nature. It can be where you are battling against the supernatural, something like fate, maybe. It can be where you are battling against society. Romeo and Juliet is an excellent example of this. But putting in all of this conflict with something outside of yourself is a great way to really dial up the emotional expression of that love. It's something that can really help us see how that love fits in the larger context of your life at that time. For memoir, that's ideal, right? It can make that love relationship seem like it really fits and really melds into your book really, really nicely. Okay, so as you are writing through your love relationship in your book, that's the main thing, is that as we're going through all of these things to avoid, things to lean into, most of them are going to have something to do with complicating things. And the way we're going to complicate it is by thinking about the conflict. Okay, so let's get to it. How might you do that and how might you not do that? Well, let's start with the things that we want you to avoid. So the first and certainly the most obvious thing we want to avoid when we're writing about love are metaphors involving the heart. Now, I think in some ways this is kind of unfair because if we think about in Shakespearean times, they could do all kinds of stuff with the heart, right? But unfortunately, in this year of 2025, we do not have the luxury of using cliched metaphors. And one of the most cliched metaphors when it comes to love is thinking about the heart. So, did your heart flutter? Yeah, it probably did. Did you feel your heart expanding? Yeah, you probably did. But we're gonna avoid these discussions of the heart just simply because they are so expected that they really don't do what you need them to do on the page. So what do you do instead? If we're going to avoid these metaphors about the heart, how do we get at the feeling? Well, the best thing you can do is if there was a bodily sensation you felt, tell us about that bodily sensation, right? Oftentimes it's sort of an uncomfortable feeling. There's often a little bit of conflict kind of built in to that feeling that you had in your body, either the feeling itself, how the feeling made you behave in a situation. Sometimes we get all tongue-tied, we stammer around because we have this weird thing happening in our body. We know we're in love. So if we're thinking about these kind of metaphors, instead, we're going to throw out the metaphor and we're going to be really specific about how that thing felt in your body. The second and really related thing that we want to avoid because it's so cliche, or because in this case, it's such a trap to fall into cliches, is dwelling on the general sense of love. Just talking about love. What does love feel like? What does love mean? These are all interesting things to think about often, and especially when we're in the beginning of a relationship, often when we kind of strengthen a relationship with a friend or a family member, we are really thinking about the nature of that love. But when we start talking about love, when we start waxing poetic about the meaning of love, Oftentimes, our readers are going to involuntarily roll their eyes. They might even shut the book. We don't want that. So, what are we going to do instead of discussing love over and over? Well, just like with the cliches, we're going to get more specific. So, if you are in an area of your memoir where you're wanting to put some kind of philosophy, sometimes we call these sequels, right? We're going to take the scene and follow it with a discussion of how we felt during that scene, what it meant to us in the larger scheme of our life. When we are at that point, I want you to think a little bit deeper. Yes, it was love, but within love, there are so many smaller concepts that are, frankly, much more interesting than love, right? Are you thinking when you're falling in love, are you thinking of safety? Are you thinking of security? Are you thinking of trust? When we're thinking about familial love, are we thinking about a shared history? Are we thinking about the meaning of lineage? Are we thinking about, what it means to be a mother and a daughter or a father and a son? What are the more interesting ways that we might think about love? Challenge yourself not to use the word love. How will you address this issue of love if you can't use the word? What would you use to get at it? I promise it's going to be a much, much more interesting way to get at that same concept. Now, along those same lines, the third thing I want you to avoid is being overly serious. Now, depending on the kind of general tone and theme and message and topic of your memoir, this may or may not be something that's challenging for you. But one thing that can be really, really difficult if your memoir is on a heavy topic is that we can be really tempted to really dial up the drama. And unfortunately, when we are trying to dial up the drama, often we lose the drama. Often we lean into what we've kind of seen in movies and TV, what we've seen kind of make our heart race in some of these popular media things. And we forget that, again, what really dials up the drama is not us putting drama on the page. It's us leaning into the conflict of the situation. It's us leaning into what we were trying to navigate as we were having all of these strong feelings, emotional, physical, mental. What were we trying to get at? And I'll tell you what, it is pretty rare that we have a loving relationship that is only serious. Most of the time when we're falling in love, we actually feel very joyful, right? So in addition to some of these kind of conflict pieces, there also is this element where we need to lighten up a little bit. When you're thinking about love, that can be a really great opportunity to add a little bit of humor, add a little bit of lightness, poke fun of ourselves, that kind of thing. And the final thing I want you to avoid along those same lines is trying to make that love story perfect. Now, I haven't talked for a while about vulnerability. When we are talking about memoir, the easiest thing that you can do to make that memoir stand out from the crowd is to be as vulnerable as possible. Now, that probably does mean putting your heart out there on the line. It's much, much more scary to release a book where you have been really open and honest and vulnerable about subjects that you're sensitive about, things that you feel maybe embarrassed, or maybe they're a little bit too private and personal, a little TMI. But when you add those things to your memoir, when you do it thoughtfully and carefully, readers feel that you are being open with them. You're giving them that sense of community, communication, really blending together their experience and yours. But we can't do that if we're so set on making sure our reader knows that this was true love, or making sure our reader knows, oh my gosh, this was a love I had never felt before. When we get too concerned about making it perfect, oftentimes we're actually making it much more imperfect. So in this case, think about what were some of the flaws? What, again, were some of the conflicts that came in to really complicate this love relationship? How can we add those in, and how can we lean into them so that we're not trying to present some kind of like a neatly wrapped gift tied up with a little bow? People don't really want that. People don't need to see a perfect love relationship. What they would rather see, I promise you, is all the messiness and complication and complexity of the human experience. So avoid that temptation to make it perfect. I know that's hard. I know that's hard, especially if you're writing about romantic love and especially if the person you're falling for is someone who's still in your life. They may not want you to put all that on the page. But if you try to make it perfect, I promise it will only push readers away. We all want to see that really vulnerable, open, honest, authentic voice on the page. And the only way you're going to do that is being open about the things that definitely were not perfect. So, the theme of these things to avoid obviously is just that they're tied up with a neat and tidy bow, right? These are things where we could probably write them without thinking much because they're the kinds of things we hear all the time, right? It was love at first sight, or my heart fluttered, or he was the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. All of these things are easy to write because they've been written before. So instead, let's talk about how we can step back from these cliches, these kind of expected metaphors, and instead write a really, really rich scene and discussion that's going to pull your reader in. Again, invite them into that umbrella of truth. Okay, so I've got 5 tips here, 5 things that you can apply depending on the type of memoir you're trying to write. They're pretty flexible guidelines, so you should be able to plug them in to whatever the vibe and theme and feel you're trying to accomplish in your metaphor. Okay, so number 1, the first thing that you can do is really lean into the dialogue of the scene. Now, I include this one for folks who are talking about things like first date, second date, third date. Oftentimes, these are times that are really endearing, that can not only help to make that love more interesting on the page, but that can also help develop you and the person you fell in love with much more deeply and richly. We're going to get a lot more information about who you are, what are your quirks and your flaws. And that's going to be useful not just for that love scene, but also as we're moving forward, getting to know you through your memoir. So for instance, on my first date with my partner, I had mentioned that I used to live in Memphis. And he said, "Oh, have you ever been to Beale Street?" Well, if you are someone that has lived in Memphis or are from Memphis, you know that actually most Memphians do not go to Beale Street. And I am such a person that has all of my emotions right on my face, and I rolled my eyes, and it was really mean. I had to apologize. Of course, he wasn't that angry. Obviously, we're still together. But I think that's a really interesting thing to think about because I don't really look great in that, right? The way that I rolled my eyes, the way that I reacted, that doesn't make me look great and it doesn't make that relationship look all that promising. But by putting that real dialogue in, we're getting a really rich sense of who you are. And in the case of my memoir, I'm thinking about these notions of trust and truth and who are you? Who is your identity as you're moving through a relationship? So, revealing the way that some of these personal quirks, these things that we carry with us every day, show up in the dialogue that you're having with that person that you love, that is such a great way to add richness to your book as a whole, to make sure that that love scene is not just in there to talk about love, but also as a way to advance the character development that you're working toward in your memoir. Okay, so we're going to lean into dialogue. The second thing I want you to do is really related to this idea of leaning into dialogue, and that is show, don't tell. Now, y'all know I have a really complicated relationship with this. Oftentimes in memoir, we actually do need to tell quite a bit. But when we're talking about things like love that are so notoriously difficult to describe, showing can be a really, really great way not only to make your writing more interesting, but to invite your reader to project their own truth about love onto your relationship. We don't want them to go too far, and that's why we're going to show. But what we do want is to leave some flexibility there so that your reader can interpret what's going on in the scene rather than us telling them, "Oh, it was love at first sight." So what do I mean by show, don't tell in the case of writing about love? Now, oftentimes when we're thinking about that feeling of love, it's often not during the encounter that we're writing about, right? This is often following. So this is where we get really tempted to put in all these metaphors, put in all this kind of philosophical discussion. But what if instead you described what was happening with you after you fell in love, after that first or second or third date? What if we think about that in terms of showing? So, for instance, were you driving home from that third date just giggling and smiling? Did you call your friend and tell them that you just had the best freaking date? If you're talking about love in terms of familial, maybe you had a new baby and you watched that baby all night long. You couldn't even fall asleep because you were so enamored by that baby. How can we talk about what happened after? How can we show that so that the reader can glean how we felt based on our behaviors? That is the perfect way to use show, don't tell, and it's going to serve you really well when we're talking about love. The third thing I want you to do as you are getting this love story on paper is I want you to think about the nuance of those feelings of love. Most of us have a little bit of person versus self conflict in almost every love relationship, right? Most of us are going to feel a little bit uncertain about that love. Maybe you're surprised to feel that love. Maybe you're really scared. Maybe you felt overwhelmed. What were some of the negative emotions that were in there in that big pot, along with those feelings of love and joy and fulfillment and excitement and promise? What were some of the emotions that maybe didn't feel quite so good that you then needed to work through to be able to really make this relationship, whatever type of relationship it was, to make that work? Add that nuance in terms of the emotion, because that's going to help us see that this is not, just some cliched story, that there is complication here. There's conflict here. We get to see how you worked through these mixed emotions that probably you had, most of us have, when we fall in love for the first time. Okay, the fourth thing I want you to do is rather than focusing on the emotions, I want you to think about what it was you loved about that person. So, this can be anything from physical traits. Maybe you love that salt and pepper beard. Maybe you love her beautiful blonde hair. Maybe you love that baby's huge blue eyes. What are the traits, the physical traits that you love about that person? Because I bet when you describe those in any level of detail, I bet we're going to pick up that you love them. I bet it's going to be really, really clear as you're describing what they looked like to you. You also can include traits that are mental and emotional. So is that somebody that really caught you off guard because they're so funny? Did they tell some specific joke that you really were so blown away by that you had to process it as love? Or are they someone that you saw was so compassionate? Are they someone that you have such great respect for in a familiar relationship, for example? Maybe you have watched them have such empathy for the people around them. Maybe you have watched them overcome insurmountable odds. I bet, just like with the physical, as you describe those mental emotional traits, I bet it will come out right there on the page how much you love that person. So get into the details of those specific traits. What is it that you love? Tell us about that. That's going to add such richness and depth, again, not just to the scene, but also to your character development, and in this case, to the other person's character development. That can be really difficult to do. So let's use it. We get a twofer because we not only get a more interesting discussion of love, we also get some of that very valuable character development that's going to serve you down the line in your book. And my final tip, tip number 5 on writing about love, is don't be afraid to use some humor. It can be so nice to add a little bit of lightness, but we don't want to add that heart fluttery lightness that can be so cliche. Instead, use humor to poke fun of the situation. Were you so wrapped up in the conversation that you dumped spaghetti down the front of your shirt? Make fun of yourself. That is a cute little detail, right? Were you so nervous that you had pit stains down to your waist? Tell us that. Be vulnerable. Let yourself be imperfect in that moment. Did you and your sister drink so much wine you couldn't hardly stand up? Tell us that. As you are revealing some of these details that let you poke fun at yourself, poke fun at your relationship, poke fun at the situation, you are going to build so much richness and give such a lightness to that description of love that, trust me, you will never achieve through those metaphors. What we're really looking for is bringing out the joy. And so often, the joy is going to come out in ways that are probably a little bit awkward. So don't shy away from those. Poke fun at yourself. Use a little bit of humor. It's going to go a long, long way. Okay, so as you're going through these 5 suggestions, again, at the root of all of them is this idea of conflict, this idea that actually nothing in life, but especially not love, is as neat and tidy as we want to remember it is, even just a short time later. So be vulnerable, be open. Think about the conflicts, the complications, the nuance of the situation, and lean into that. Don't worry if you feel like you're going a little long. We're going to need a little bit of page space to make sure that this doesn't come across as silly or cliche or self-indulgent. Get in there, write about your love story, and I hope you all have a really happy Valentine's Day, and of course, happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.